Well, we were just speaking to Neil Griffith about Remembrance Sunday there and some of Labour's plans to help veterans. And to mark the event today, we had the chance to sit down this week for a rare interview with the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir Nick Carter. I was in Grimsby at the time, so my colleague Alistair Bunkall, our Defence and Security correspondent, went along. And with the NATO summit to be held in London next month, he began the interview by asking General Carter about the importance of NATO.
I think in many ways it's never been as important in its 70 years of its life, because the threats are very diverse now. We talk a lot about Russia, but of course what we also need to be conscious of is that there are threats to NATO's southern flank from the way Africa is evolving, from migration, and of course from terrorism as well. So this year we signed off a new NATO military strategy, the first time since 1967. And that's a strategy that does try and take a 360-degree look at the problems that Europe has to confront in security terms. So I think in terms of the alliance, it's probably as important as it's ever been.
Do you think it's being undermined at the edges, whether that's through a US president who criticises member states for not spending enough, whether it's Turkey for buying Russian equipment, for example?
No, I don't think so. I think there are always tensions in alliances. It's the same as a marriage. And the plain fact is, with 29 nations, it's very important that we all come together and we all contribute to that alliance in a fair way. So I think it's right that burden sharing is on the agenda and that people aspire to spend the 2% of their GDP and the 20% of that on their equipment that was signed up to in Wales in 2014.
Let me read you a quote from that precise moment, Wales 2014. Come the end of the Cold War in 1990, that should have been the time for NATO to shut up shop, give up, go home and go away.
Well, of course, we all had a huge amount of optimism in 1989 as the wall came down, and we're celebrating that, of course, over the last couple of weeks. But the reality is that the world has changed. It's moved on. We now have what I think would be characterized as global competition between great powers, something that we probably haven't seen of this ilk since the middle and the early part of the last century. So I think NATO's relevance is now back where it was during the Cold War because of the nature of that threat and that evolving global strategic context.
The quote I read you was said by Jeremy Corbyn. He could be Prime Minister in a few weeks' time. Presumably you therefore entirely disagree with his opinion on NATO.
Well, you wouldn't expect me during an election campaign to make any observations about politics at all. My job is to provide a military advice to whoever will be the leader of the day.
Entirely. However, if you feel that he in any way jeopardised the national security of this country, I would perhaps expect you to make that clear as people go to the polls.
My job is to serve whoever is the leader of the day and to provide the appropriate military advice when they ask me to do that.
But I've asked you about NATO and your support of NATO, and you would clearly have a very different view on NATO to Jeremy Corbyn.
I don't know is the straight answer, but my view as a military advisor to any leader of this country is that NATO remains a very important part of our national security, and it's right and proper that we should lean into NATO in every way possible.
Can I ask you about the ISC's report into Russian interference? I ask you only because you sit on the National Security Council. I mean, do you have an opinion on whether or not that should have been released, given that it was cleared by the intelligence agencies?
No, because once again, this is a political question, and it's the choice of the Prime Minister as to whether he published this report at the moment. The report, as I understand it, is still going through a process, and I have not yet seen it myself.
Let's then turn to the map behind you, D-Day. This year we marked the 75th anniversary of that event. It was an opportune moment to remember the selflessness and the heroism of those who went across to northern France on that moment.
Yes, certainly, and of course that's why remembrance matters to us as well. And I think what anniversaries like D-Day do for us is they provide us with an opportunity to educate people. Because I think it is a fact these days that fewer people probably study history or certainly know history. And on the back of that, I think anniversaries are a chance to bring some of that to life. And of course what's interesting about D-Day is we always think, rightly I'm sure, about the bravery of those who stormed the beaches and who enabled the operation from the sea and from the air. But actually the interesting thing about D-Day was really it was a national enterprise. It was an enterprise where most of society got behind it, and scientists, businessmen, railway engineers, people who understood programming and that sort of detail all came together to provide some really quite ingenious solutions to what were really quite difficult problems to solve. And that notion of a national enterprise, I think, is relevant to some of the problems and challenges that we have today. And certainly in terms of how our armed forces need to be supported, and what we need to do as we modernise definitely requires us to think hard about how we mobilise the effort, not just of the private sector, but of society as a whole.
Do you think it's a national characteristic that we are lacking at the moment?
I wouldn't say that. I think we're living through a period of phenomenal change at the moment. It's change that is probably more enormous than even the two world wars combined. And it's also, the pace of it is increasing rapidly. And on the basis of that, I think we do need to think pretty hard about how, as a nation, we're going to manage that change. And it matters to our armed forces hugely.
Is there a lesson, though? Is there anything we can take from those men and women who performed such heroic actions in order to liberate Europe on that day?
Well, I mean, I think the lesson I've taken from it is that we need to avail ourselves of all of the skills and talent in our society in order to deal with today's problems. And that requires, I think, a much more integrated approach across all of our national effort.
How do you assess the British approach to the armed forces at the moment, given where we are in terms of our engagement around the world?
Well, I can't remember a time, certainly in my lifetime, when the armed forces were more popular. And we polled an approval rating of gusting 90% last year. I think the risk, of course, though, with the unpopular campaigns of the last 10 to 15 years, is that that popularity can often be based on sympathy and not on empathy. And of course, our veterans and our armed forces, they don't want to be pitied because they serve. What they actually want is they want to be respected. So I think in terms of our relationship with society, we'd very much like it to be based upon respect. And I think a lot of people understand that. But I go back to my point about education. It's important that we continue to educate people on that.
At the risk of dragging you again into politics, the armed forces have global projection. What role could you therefore play in a post-Brexit world in order to try and fulfil government's agenda of having a global Britain?
Well, I think we need to have a conversation as a nation about what sort of nation we want to be in the future. And of course, what the armed forces offer in support of our foreign security policy is the ability to have a presence globally. And we do that in all sorts of ways. I mean, at the moment, it may surprise people to know that we've had people in some 65 different countries this year, either providing training or indeed operational input to what's occurring. We do that through our Navy, of course, which is its most obvious embodiment of global, but we also do it through our Air Force and also through our Army. So there's a great deal that we can do globally in order to be able to promote our values, promote our influence, and to project our image, and indeed to promote our prosperity. And I think the armed forces is an extraordinarily good way of achieving that, because the values that we espouse are the values that many of our allies also wish to espouse.
Chief of Defence Staff, thank you very much.
Thanks.